You think you know the search for Spock? Think again. Leonard Nimoy forced the studio to let him direct by threatening to walk away. William Shatner fought a real fire to save the sets. The script was printed on special paper that couldn't be photocopied.
Say, wow, what a great idea. Leonard Nimoy directing Star Trek sounds good.
And the Enterprise was destroyed specifically to traumatize fans who'd already mourned Spock. Today we're exposing 14 hidden truths behind the search for Spock, including why Kirstie Alley was replaced, how a Romulan ship became Klingon, and the cost-cutting measure that accidentally became the film's most memorable scene. Let's get into it. 1. Nimoy's ultimatum. After spending decades playing Spock and even demanding the character be killed off in The Wrath of Khan, Leonard Nimoy had a change of heart during filming. He fell back in love with the role. He wasn't ready to let go. But instead of just agreeing to return for the sequel, Nimoy made a bold demand. He wanted to direct the film himself. Studio head Michael Eisner was horrified. He famously told Nimoy, "I hate it." Eisner didn't believe actors should direct their own franchises, especially not television actors who'd never helmed a feature film before, but Paramount was desperate. They knew that without Nimoy's full commitment, the movie would fail, so they gave in. Nimoy became the first Star Trek cast member to sit in the director's chair, setting a precedent that would define the franchise for decades. Sometimes the actor knows best. 2. The unphotocopiable script. After The Wrath of Khan suffered from major plot leaks that spoiled Spock's death before the film even opened, Paramount became obsessed with preventing any information from escaping. Their solution was ingenious for 1984. The script was printed on deep red paper that couldn't be photocopied using standard technology. Any attempt to duplicate the pages would result in a completely black, unreadable mess. Leonard Nimoy wouldn't even tell his own family what the movie was about. Cast and crew signed strict non-disclosure agreements. Anyone caught sharing plot details faced immediate termination. It was a level of paranoia that feels quaint by modern standards. But it worked. Most audiences walked into theaters having no idea they were about to watch the Enterprise self-destruct. 3. The Kirstie Alley salary dispute. One of the most controversial decisions was the replacement of Kirstie Alley as Sarek. Alley had been a breakout star in The Wrath of Khan. A memorable performance as the young Vulcan officer who challenged Spock intellectually and emotionally. When it came time to negotiate her return, her agents reportedly asked for significantly more money than Paramount was willing to pay. The studio refused. Alley walked away. She was replaced by Robin Curtis, a relative unknown who did her best to match Alley's performance. Fans were furious. Curtis faced years of harassment and dismissal from the fan base, with Trekkies insisting she wasn't the real Sarek. The controversy became so toxic that the character was slowly phased out of future films. A salary dispute ended what could have been a major ongoing role in the franchise. 4. Christopher Lloyd's method. Klingon. Before Christopher Lloyd became famous as Doc Brown in Back to the Future, he was cast as Commander Krug, the ruthless Klingon villain. Lloyd approached the role with intense method acting. He stayed in character as a brutal warrior even between takes. He would stalk around the set in full Klingon makeup and costume, barking orders at background actors, refusing to break character during lunch breaks. The extras and bit players were genuinely intimidated by him. That was exactly what Lloyd wanted. He believed the only way to make Krug feel dangerous was to embody that menace in real life. It's one of the most committed villain performances in Star Trek history, and fascinating to watch knowing Lloyd would soon become famous for playing the complete opposite, warm, eccentric scientists. 5. The studio fire. During production, a massive fire broke out on the Paramount lot. Multiple sound stages were threatened, including the ones being used for the search for Spock. The Genesis planet set, which had taken weeks to construct and was one of the most expensive builds in the entire film, was directly in the path of the flames. William Shatner didn't wait for instructions. He grabbed a fire hose and started fighting the blaze alongside professional firefighters. Other cast and crew members joined him, desperately trying to save the sets before they were completely destroyed. Shatner's quick thinking helped contain the fire long enough for the fire department to bring it under control. The Genesis set was saved with only minor smoke damage. It's one of the most heroic behind-the-scenes moments in Star Trek history, and it's completely overshadowed by everything else that happened during this chaotic production. 6. The rotting Genesis planet. Unlike the Wrath of Khan, which used real outdoor locations, the Search for Spock built the entire alien forest environment on a massive indoor soundstage. The production design team constructed towering trees, thick vegetation, and rocky terrain, all inside a climate-controlled building they could light and shoot in any weather. There was one catastrophic problem. The massive lights required to simulate the sun generated so much heat that the real plants they'd brought in for texture began to rot and die. As filming dragged on, the soundstage started to smell like a compost heap. Decaying leaves and molding vegetation filled the air with a nauseating stench. The cast and crew had to power through the final weeks of Genesis Planet shooting while trying not to gag. It's a miracle that none of that discomfort shows on screen. 7. Destroying the Enterprise. The single most controversial creative decision was the destruction of the Enterprise. Fans were horrified when they saw the iconic starship, home of the crew for nearly 2 decades, deliberately blown apart and sent crashing into the Genesis planet. The decision came from producer Harve Bennett. He believed that after killing Spock in the previous film, the only way to raise the stakes even higher was to kill the ship itself. It was an emotional gut punch designed to traumatize audiences who had already mourned their favorite character. The destruction sequence was filmed with painstaking detail, the Enterprise burning and breaking apart in slow motion. The scene is still emotionally devastating 40 years later. It proved that Star Trek was willing to sacrifice anything, even its most sacred icons, for the sake of storytelling. 8. The illegal bird of prey. Here's a continuity error that still drives fans crazy. The Klingon bird of prey was originally designed as a Romulan ship. The script initially featured Romulan villains, and the production design team created a ship based on the classic bird motif associated with Romulan culture, complete with a cloaking device and predatory aesthetics. But late in the writing process, the studio decided Klingons were more iconic and marketable than Romulans, so they changed the villains, without changing the ship design. This created a bizarre inconsistency. The Klingons suddenly had a bird of prey with clearly Romulan design elements and technology that shouldn't exist in their fleet. The contradiction was never explained in the film. Later films tried to retcon the issue, but the damage was already done. 9. The self-destruct code. The self-destruct sequence is one of the most iconic scenes in the film. Kirk and his senior officers solemnly authorizing the destruction of their own ship. Here's the nerdy detail most people miss. The sequence uses the exact same voice authorization codes that were first established in the 1960s, original series episode, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. The production went back and pulled the specific phrasing and syntax from that 20-year-old episode to maintain continuity. It's an incredibly nerdy attention to detail that most audiences would never notice. But for hardcore Trekkies, it's proof that the filmmakers actually cared about honoring the history of the franchise. The sequence remains one of the most emotionally powerful moments in Star Trek history, a perfect marriage of technical procedure and personal sacrifice. 10. ILM's miniature mastery. While the Wrath of Khan had pioneered computer-generated imagery with the Genesis effect, the Search for Spock went in the opposite direction. It relied almost entirely on massive physical miniatures. Industrial Light and Magic built enormous scale models of every ship and space station in the film. Some were so large they had to be moved around the studio with forklifts. The space dock model, the massive orbital station where the Enterprise is docked at the beginning, was particularly impressive. Thousands of tiny fiber optic lights embedded in the structure simulated windows and interior illumination. The detail work was so intricate that close-up shots of the miniature look more realistic than many modern CGI effects. It was a massive flex from ILM, proof that practical effects could still compete with the emerging digital revolution. 11. The Faltor Pan language. The Vulcan ritual language, spoken during the climactic ceremony, wasn't just invented by the actors on set. It was created by Mark Okrand, a professional linguist brought in specifically to develop authentic-sounding alien dialogue. Okrand would later become famous for creating the full Klingon language that fans still use today. But his work on the search for Spock was his first major contribution to Star Trek. He constructed a grammatically consistent Vulcan language with its own phonetic rules and sentence structures. The actors had actual words to memorize rather than just random sounds. The ritual feels ancient and sacred because the language itself has depth and logic behind it. Okrand's work elevated what could have been a silly mystical scene into something genuinely moving. 12. Sarek's first movie appearance. Mark Lenard had played Spock's father Sarek in the original series, most notably in the classic episode Journey to Babel. The search for Spock marked his first appearance in a Star Trek feature film. The character had been absent from the motion picture in The Wrath of Khan. Bringing him back was a deliberate choice to bridge the gap between the television era and the movie era. Lenard's performance is one of the emotional anchors of the film, particularly in the scene where Sarek confronts Kirk about leaving Spock's body on the Genesis planet. His quiet dignity and barely restrained grief make it clear that this isn't just a plot device. This is a father mourning his son. That emotional reality grounds the entire resurrection storyline in something genuine and human, even though the character is Vulcan. 13. The Stealing the Enterprise. Accident. One of the most beloved sequences is when Kirk and his crew infiltrate the dry-docked Enterprise and steal their own ship to go rescue Spock. The scene has a haunting, ghostly quality. The ship feels empty and abandoned. Darkened corridors and silent engineering decks emphasize how alone the crew is. Here's the secret. That atmospheric emptiness wasn't just a creative choice. It was a cost-saving measure. The production couldn't afford to hire dozens of background extras to populate the ship. So they simply removed everyone and framed it as the Enterprise being in mothballs. What could have been a budgetary limitation became one of the most memorable visual decisions in the film, creating a sense of melancholy and loss that perfectly matches the emotional state of the characters. Sometimes the best creative choices come from necessity. 14. The ending set up everything. The Search for Spock was the first Star Trek movie to end on a direct cliffhanger. The crew became fugitives, stranded on Vulcan with no ship and no way home. Previous films had wrapped up their stories neatly. This one deliberately left everything unresolved. It was a risky move that banked on audiences coming back for the next installment. The gamble paid off spectacularly. The cliffhanger led directly into Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, which became the highest-grossing film of the original cast era and introduced Star Trek to mainstream audiences who'd never watched the television show. The decision to turn these films into an ongoing, serialized narrative rather than standalone adventures changed the entire franchise model. It paved the way for how modern blockbuster franchises tell connected stories across multiple films. The Search for Spock is proof that Star Trek was never afraid to take risks, destroying beloved icons, replacing popular actors, ending on cliffhangers that left audiences desperate for more, letting an actor direct his own franchise for the first time. It bridges the gap between the death of Spock and his resurrection, between the old television era and the cinematic future of the franchise, with grace, emotion, and some of the best miniature effects work in science fiction history. If you haven't watched it in a while, or if you've only seen the even-numbered films because of that ridiculous curse, give The Search for Spock another chance. You might be surprised by how well it holds up. Which behind-the-scenes secret shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most underrated Star Trek films, hit subscribe for more stories about the movies that took risks and changed everything. See you in the next one.